All right, let's jump right in. What we're doing today is kind of like opening a time capsule. We're going back to October 2014 to look at this really provocative blog post from the Arab world. And let me tell you, it's not a dry analysis. It's this fiery, metaphorical, and super critical take on the state of things during a really chaotic period.
And this cartoon, which comes straight from that blog post, just tells you everything you need to know. Look at this figure, bandaged up, bleeding, arrows in his back, and he's hunched over a book called Contemporary Arab History. This makes it crystal clear, right? This isn't some detached academic paper. It's a raw, passionate, and pretty painful critique. And that's exactly what we're going to break down.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. We're actually going to follow the author's own structure. He uses this really interesting device, a fictional scholar, to lay out his arguments. So we'll start with the scholar's grim findings, then we'll look at what the author calls the anatomy of decay from within. After that, we'll dive into his take on a foe's winning strategy, a supposed war on identity, this really interesting nostalgia for a lost empire, and finally, we'll get to the tough, unanswered questions the author just leaves you with at the end.
All right, let's get into the first part. To make his case, the author doesn't just list facts. Instead, he uses this narrative tool, a fictional scholar who's basically our guide through this whole analysis.
And here he is, Harun. The author describes him as a scholar of law and history, and his whole deal is that he's obsessed with one question: why do great civilizations fall? So, just to be clear, whenever we talk about Harun's findings, we're really talking about the author's own arguments. Harun is his mouthpiece.
You know, what's fascinating is how the author sets Harun up. He's not just some random historian. He studies ancient civilizations, sure, but also the works of the legendary Ibn Khaldun, who was the expert on the rise and fall of empires. But then you get to these last 2 points, and wow, he studies how summits turn into boots and how values turn into rubble. I mean, that's heavy, right? It tells you we're not just getting a history lesson. This is a deep dive into what the author sees as a complete moral collapse.
Okay, so Harun has this background in studying why things fall apart. Now he takes that same lens and turns it inward, on the Arab world itself. And his first big finding, it's all about a deep, internal decay, a moral, political, and social rot that he believes is just eating away at these nations from the inside.
And this cartoon is the perfect visual for that. Remember that phrase we just talked about, how summits turn into boots? Well, here you have it. This image, right from the source, is a powerful commentary on leadership that the author sees as totally ineffective, just a tiny figure swallowed up by this giant chair of power. And then the critique gets, well, surprisingly specific. It zooms in on something as simple as public cleanliness. The author sees dirty streets not just as a mess, but as a physical symptom of that deeper moral rot. He draws this really sharp contrast, right? On one side, he's praising places like Malaysia and Turkey for being clean and orderly, but on the other, he claims that Arab nations would be buried in garbage if it weren't for foreign workers. For him, this isn't about litter. It's about a society losing its fundamental sense of collective pride.
Okay, so after looking at the internal problems, the analysis pivots to outside forces. Harun, and of course the author, lays out a very specific argument for how he saw Israel's strategy succeeding back in 2014.
And this quote really gets to the heart of his argument. He says, Israel has reached the stage of being an observer and spectator, laughing from behind the walls of Galilee. So the picture he's painting here is of an adversary that's so successful it doesn't even have to fight anymore. It can just sit back, watch, and benefit from all the infighting in the Arab world.
So you might be asking, how does he think this happened? Well, he lays out this whole strategy he calls breaking psychological barriers. He says it all started with Egyptian President Sadat's historic visit to Israel. That was step 1. Then, step 2, he argues that the media, and he specifically calls out Al Jazeera with its famous slogan, "The opinion and the other opinion," amplified this. He claims that by constantly featuring polished Israeli officials, they basically normalized the relationship and created a media landscape where Arabs were tearing each other apart while their main adversary was presented as, in his words, a gentle lamb.
And these 2 cartoons from the blog post just nail that contrast. On one side, you have a slick, well-dressed wolf talking to a bunch of sheep. That's the cunning adversary. And on the other, you have 2 Arabs literally drilling holes in the boat they're both sitting in. It's a brutal metaphor for self-destruction, and that's exactly the dynamic the author is trying to highlight.
All right, let's shift gears to the next major theme in this piece. The author calls it a war on identity. He's making the case that there was a deliberate, targeted attack on Islam and the cultural identity of the Arab world.
And he doesn't mince words. He says the Arab world is being used as a model for how to distort religion in 2 days. I mean, that's about as blunt as it gets. He sees the region as a negative example, a live demonstration of how to corrupt faith.
And here's the core of his argument on this point. He's claiming there's a huge double standard at play. On the one hand, he says Israel is free to be an openly religious state. But at the same time, in neighboring Arab countries, he alleges that religious identity is being suppressed. He literally claims mosques are being closed while bars are popping up everywhere.
This quote really puts us right back in that specific moment, late 2014. The author's talking about the global war against ISIS, which was just getting underway. But look at how he frames it. He doesn't see it as a war on terror. He sees it as a world war on an Islamic state, the idea of one. And he says the Arabs are the ones paying the ultimate price.
Now, running through this whole critique is another really interesting, maybe even surprising theme. It's this deep, almost painful nostalgia for the old Ottoman Empire and the strength and unity it represented.
And this visual really helps connect the dots for us. Throughout the post, the author constantly praises modern-day Turkey for what he sees as its success and independence. And in his writing, that praise is tied directly to its legacy as the center of the powerful Ottoman Empire, which he holds up as the gold standard for the unity and strength he feels is now completely lost.
And it turns out, this isn't just some random historical daydreaming. The blog post itself is actually linked to a group called the National Ottoman Movement, which is a cultural and social movement. And when you learn that, the whole thing suddenly clicks into place, right? This isn't just a random critique of the present. It's a lament for a very specific, lost, unified past, all seen through this particular political lens.
So, after laying out this incredibly bleak diagnosis of internal rot and external manipulation, the author doesn't really offer any solutions. Instead, he ends the whole thing by just leaving the reader with a series of really provocative questions. Questions that absolutely captured the uncertainty of that moment in 2014.
First up, he questions the real motivation behind the war on ISIS. Is it actually a war on terror, he asks? Or is it really an economic ploy designed to drain the Arab world of its oil and its money?
Then he comes back to that idea of psychological warfare we talked about. He asks, has that strategy of breaking psychological barriers actually worked? Has it managed to completely shatter the will of the people and fragment their societies from the inside? And his final question really nails the time frame down to late 2014. At that time, the Houthis were making huge gains in Yemen, right on the border of Saudi Arabia. So the author asks, will this threat right on the doorstep of Islam's holy sites, will this finally be the alarm bell that wakes the region up?
But he doesn't wait around for an answer. He just signs off with this final, heartbreaking lament. May God have mercy on the sons of Othman and the Arabs of the end of time. He's mourning both the lost legacy of the Ottomans and what he sees as a generation at the brink. It's a powerful, deeply pessimistic snapshot from a very specific point in time, and it really leaves you thinking about how much or how little has changed since then.